Thank you all for coming. Welcome to the University of Washington, Tacoma, and the University of Washington, the University Writing Program, third annual Symposium on Writing. We have two speakers every year. This is our first speaker this year. And this year's theme is Black Lives Matter and Writing in the University. And one of our first guest is Dr. Vershawn Ashanti Young, who's going to give us a talk in just a second. Dr. Vershawn Ashanti Young is an associate professor at the University of Waterloo in Canada in the Drama and Speech Communications Department, where he teaches courses in communication, English, and performance. He has also been a faculty member at the University of Iowa and the University of Kentucky. He is the originator of the concept of code meshing, which is the act of combining dialects, vernaculars, and colloquial Englishes with standard written English, particularly for English classrooms. Among his many publications, Dr. Young is the author of Your Average Nigga, Performing Race, Literacy, and Masculinity, Code Meshing as World English, Pedagogy, Policy, Performance, From Bourgeois to Bougie, Black Middle-Class Performances, and Other People's English, Code Meshing, Code Switching, and African-American Literacy. To conclude my introduction of him, I'd like to read an excerpt from his book, Your Average Nigga, because I think in one way it helps us think about why Black Lives Matter in writing and the university. In the book, Young argues that literacy is a racial performance. In a late chapter, he speaks of a black male student of his, Cam, who writes about the difference between school and the streets he has grown up on and survived. Streets in which the only scholars are dead, and the only thing you're taught is pain. Young says, I read this, Cam's essay, as Cam's critique of the idea that the problem of black students in our schools is the problem of black identity. The problem, as Cam sees it, is the problem of escaping poverty, and that problem, as he's helped me see, is only made worse, in fact, insoluble, when we redescribe the tools for escaping poverty as tools for escaping identity, or as ways to protect it. I argue that the schools are symptoms of the problem, and that what we do in them cannot function as a solution to the problem. In short, as long as the only debate we can imagine ourselves having is the debate between BEV, Black English Vernacular, and WEV, White English Vernacular, it doesn't matter who wins, because no one wins. A few Cams will make it, a few Eric Smiths will make it, and a few Keith Gilliards. But millions will continue to lose, particularly those who, as Cam writes, stand on the sidelines and hope. Without any further ado, I leave it up to you, Dr. Vershawn Ashanti.
I'm so happy to be here and thrilled to be in this part of the country because it's warmer than where I'm coming from, and actually really beautiful. And I want to thank Asal for inviting me and making this event happen. And I'm always happy to spend as much time as I can with Asal. He's a really good friend of mine and really good colleague, and we've been fighting for about, 10 years now. I think I'm winning, finally. And I want to thank his wife, Kelly, for keeping him grounded. So I don't always have to step in. I also want to thank the University of Washington, Tacoma for having events like this and opening up spaces for deep and rich and challenging conversations. And we're going to have a challenging conversation today as well. And part of my speaking approach is to involve the audience. So at some point here, I'm going to be asking you questions. Now, as long as you don't talk too much, you can answer the questions. And I want you to actually participate. I've spent my entire career as an academic focusing on the humanity of African Americans in the academy. And I take as you will see in a moment, a somewhat different view of what it means to be a successful African American student and a successful African American professional and academic in the academy than what is commonly embraced. What is commonly embraced, I will tell you right now, is the idea of code switching. And code switching means essentially speaking a different way in different settings. So speaking African American English at home or around friends, and taking on a what is understood to be a professional or academic persona at work and at school. I've never embraced that philosophy, even though it is commonly espoused, as you will see, because it creates a kind of dysphoria, a kind of dissonance internally within African Americans. And it also perpetuates intercultural and interracial conflict, as you will see. So it's not just an internal conflict that I'm concerned about, it's also that interracial conflict that I'm concerned about. And I combine this concern with my work in literacy, because I believe that the literacy classroom and work in education and teaching reading, writing, and speaking has an effect on the humanity that I'm talking about. So I want to use that as a framework for talking about the Black Lives Matter movement, or to be more precise, allowing some of the online performances that derive from the Black Lives Matter movement to speak to us and for us to have a conversation. I want to begin by showing you this clip from, I want to show you this because as a group recently has come together to form a response to why every culture, but particularly whites, should be interested and involved in the Black Lives Matter movement. There's now a White People for Black Lives Matter, which I think is really important. But Mark Zuckerberg, who is the CEO of Facebook, illustrated how non-Black people can support Black Lives Matter, and I want to illustrate that here. I show that to help us appreciate how people in authority and in power are embracing the Black Lives Matter movement, or embracing learning about it from different cultural perspectives. And here is a response by a performance artist involved in the Black Lives Matter movement to the kind of thing that Mark Zuckerberg was responding to. In this, spoken word performance, you will hear this poet talking about violence and the effect that violence has on African Americans. And it isn't just physical violence that I want you to pay attention to. Now, in a seminar, there would be a lot to unpack in that. I want to highlight two things. I show this because I'm presenting this talk in 3 lessons. And the first lesson is be conscious of the violence of literacy instruction. Now, this video from the Black Lives Matter movement illustrates how exigencies that arise from police interaction with Black people prompt a rhetorical response. It prompts the response of the riots as well, but it also prompts an opportunity to share via speaking and communication, which is what she did. It also shows that violence is not just that physical violence that you encounter, that we see with Eric Gardner or Trayvon Martin or some other Black men and women and Latino men and women who have lost their lives at the hands of aggressive police tactics. But that violence is an everyday, psychic, emotional violence that actually leads to and contributes to the aggressive police tactics, where Blackness has to be hyper-policed, hyper-surveilled. And I want to show you that, how that happens in a literacy classroom and in literacy lessons with this next video. And here's where you'll have an opportunity to contribute. Now, I had to walk out here. Did you notice a problem in this lesson? Now, this lesson comes from study.com. And in various disciplines and fields, they have lessons that you can purchase, and some of them you can get for free. This one, you can get half of the lesson for free, and this is half of the free lesson. And some teachers use these. Actually, many teachers use these in their classrooms. Do you see a problem? Did you see a problem about linguistic representation in this first part of this lesson? And don't be shy. Yes.
British accent is cool and de facto interesting.
Yeah.
Somebody with an accent, it's left to you to figure out what that accent is, but it's, that person is boring as mud.
Right, exactly. Now, what's really interesting is that you can racialize this, right? Race is inferred here. Professor Bigelow does not sound like Professor Ojikutu, who could also come from England, right? So you can imagine that the privileged persona is a white male British professor who, in this context, is even accentless, even though he has a British accent, right? It's so cool. Then it's contrasted with someone a female professor who has an accent that's thicker than mud. And already that's setting up a hierarchy that actually perpetuates some of the prejudicial views, in fact, racist views that some students have, particularly in regards to professors who come from places outside of England or America and who speak with accents. One linguist, Rosina Lippi-Green, in her book, English with an Accent, Language and Discrimination in the US, says that many times immigrant professors who speak with an accent have lower evaluations than other professors because students perceive to not be able to understand their English, even though their English is highly understandable. A lesson like this unwittingly perpetuates a prejudicial view for students. Because while a teacher might use this in their classroom, they're not going to be unpacking it the way in which we're unpacking it here, and for the kind of violence that it can enact. Now, so how many people, based on this discussion, think that this is a problem? Raise your hand, please. Okay, thank you. I'm glad that we're on the same page, because what you're about to see is even worse. If the speaker had practiced, she would have avoided a terrifying situation. The one thing about this clip is that it does all the work for me that I want to do right here. It completely shows you the relationship between literacy and physical acts of violence. Now, this is obviously, I hope that the person that created this lesson plan did not do this intentionally. But you can't help but see how her mind, the person that constructed this lesson, went to what are the consequences of not meeting the expectations of how someone should sound, or the language or accent that they should have or be speaking. What are the consequences? She goes straight to the ultimate consequence of physical violence. Now, acts has been attributed to African American English, and she's saying that this person should have practiced out of the African American English, because if you use it, you're subject to physical violence and you can avoid it, which is a problem, because no one's accent should lead to acts of physical violence by someone else. So what we teach in literacy classrooms, and also the literacies that we teach outside of the context of reading and writing classrooms in particular, we have to be careful about the racial views that we are presenting in the lessons that we teach, which is one of the reasons why I'm against code switching as a practice. A number of scholars and educators recognize the violence that can come from as a result of prejudicial views about African American English, but they don't attack the violence. They want to put the burden on African Americans, particularly students, to shape shift out of the violence, as if they can avoid the violence by placing this burden on them. Here's Bill Cosby in his 2004 Pound Cake speech, and here's how he represented African American English. And you'll notice how he perpetuates a violence against African American English. He says, it's standing on the corner. It can't speak English. It doesn't want to speak English. Why you ain't? Where you is, go, Ra? I don't know why these people, I don't know who these people are. And I blamed the kid until I heard the mother talk. Then I heard the father talk. This is all in the house. You used to talk a certain way on the corner and you got into the house and switched to English. Now there's a couple of violent representations in the way that Bill Cosby is constructing his speech. A, he's using an impersonal pronoun, it, to stand in for a person. That's already dehumanizing. The other thing that he does is he presents a nuclear family, the mother, the kid, and the father, as a disparaging, or he disparages this nuclear family. Now, what's ironic about this is that in public discourse, African Americans are constantly criticized for not having a nuclear family, that there's the mother raising the kids. And here you have a nuclear family, and what Bill Cosby is focusing on is their language. That's a real problem. But let me show you how he gets, like that clip that we saw, directly to violence. Everybody knows it's important to speak English except these knuckleheads. You can't land a plane with why you ain't, why you can't be a doctor with that kind of crap coming out of your mouth. There is no Bible that has that kind of language. First of all, you can land a plane using any language. And secondly, I don't know what Bible Bill Cosby has been reading, but since the Bible has been translated out of Latin into the common vocabulary of everybody, it's always been a common colloquial language that the Bible has been written in. So he has his facts misconstrued. People getting shot in the back of the head over a piece of pound cake. Then we all run out and are outraged. The cops shouldn't have shot him. What the hell was he doing with the pound cake in his hand? So I got to come back close to the audience again to unpack Bill Cosby's speech, because he's actually in a certain kind of way justifying the over-policing of black bodies and the assault, the physical assault on black bodies by saying, well, wait a minute, they had a piece of pound cake and they got shot. Well, in our judicial system, we don't execute people for petty crimes. As a matter of fact, a piece of pound cake might not even rise to the level of a misdemeanor. So how is it that stealing a piece of pound cake can lead to someone being shot? It is something to be outraged over. But when we talk about African Americans, truly, there's something that happens. We diminish and reduce the regular judicial process because we put this heavy burden on black people to always try to rise above the negative, which is impossible for any person and any culture. And this is one of the things that I want, if you leave with nothing else, to have you sit with, how we reduce in many everyday ways the humanity of black people. Here's Lisa Delpit, who is a noted scholar in education, particularly in elementary education. And in her essay, No Kind of Sense, she talks about an interaction that she has with her daughter, Maya. And Maya had attended an all-white school, and she was doing okay in her grades, but Professor Delpit thought that her self-esteem and her affect when she would come home was not what she wanted it to be. She noticed some concerns with her daughter. So she took her daughter out of the predominantly white school and placed her in a predominantly African-American charter school. Here's a dialogue from that essay that responds to how her daughter picked up some of the African-American language habits from her peers. I asked my daughter Maya if she knows why I critique her language. Maya, you don't have to worry about me because I know how to code switch. I do listen to you sometimes. And Lisa Delpit. So when my child's language reflects that of some of her African-American peers, I feel the eyes of the other negatively assessing her intelligence, her incompetence, her potential, and yes, even her moral fiber. So I forgive myself for my perhaps overly emotional reaction, my painful ambivalence. You don't see anything in Lisa Delpit's, and this is the complete quote in her response to Maya, you don't see anything about Maya's language being ineffective or the communication not being understood. The problem here is an ethical and moral problem that she's pointing out about how her daughter is perceived because of using African American English. And instead of attacking that perception, that ideology that leads to that perception, she's putting a burden on her daughter and actually has constructed or made it structural within her own household where she critiques her daughter's language at home. Patricia Edwards is the past president of the International Reading Association, another African-American scholar. And this is what she says about the African-American students who use African-American English. Most teachers of African-American children believe that their students' life chances will be further hampered if they do not learn standard English. In the stratified society in which we live, they are absolutely right. Okay, we can accept that point. It might be true that we live in a prejudicial society that holds negative views about African-American English. That doesn't make it right. And the thing, again, this educator wants to put the burden on the students to educate them out of using African-American English in schools and in the public setting because of the stratified society in which we live. And it seems interesting to me as a side note that some people who would say we're in a post-racial society or don't live with the same kind of segregation that we did in, let's say, the 1960s, will at the same time say that this is true, that we live in a stratified society. They will say that for other things, but when it comes to language education, oh yeah, our society is stratified, so you have to use a different kind of English. So this is what Edwards proposes. She says, we have talked about double consciousness as the best of both worlds. Know how to make it in a white world, but still know you are a black person. She is promoting the view, she's promoting the view in a way in which he did not intend it to be promoted, of W.B. Du Bois's concept of double consciousness, where black people were always seeing themselves through the eyes of others, or through the eyes of the other, meaning white society. And he was talking about the effect, the internal, emotional, psychological effect of segregation on African Americans. So that was in 1903. And Patricia Edwards is espousing his view and asking African Americans who live in a post-segregation to still adopt double consciousness as a strategy. Du Bois says this. He said that double consciousness is a peculiar sensation, always looking at oneself through the eyes of others. And here's what he wanted in 1903. It's a longing to merge his double self into a better and truer self. Not a split self where you're black living in a white society, but where you can be black in a society that's integrated, and you don't have to be two different individuals. I want to show you in this next clip the effect that double consciousness, the rhetoric of violence and literacy has on African Americans, particularly African American men, and how it is performed. It's funny, but it's sad. Did you notice the violence there? I don't have to point it out. I want someone to tell us. Where was the violence? Yes.
At the end, when he thought that he almost got mugged.
Exactly. Stay, wait. Keep the mic. Why did he think he almost got mugged? Was there anything that would suggest to any reasonable person that he was in a threatening situation?
No.
Go ahead.
You can notice you can notice a little bit of the lead up to that line, though. The body language was like, all of a sudden the guy went like this, and he was kind of looking like this. So there was that sense of sort of psychological violence going on.
Mm-hmm.
It's the language that he heard. Because once he came out, the other one started changing the way he talked. And therefore, his impression changed.
And did you notice that he was also performing the
Yeah,
same language
both of them
himself?
were doing that, yeah.
And one other person?
I think part of the violence was he was also speaking to the whoever they were speaking to on the phone, on the receiving end. They were also on the receiving end of like, I'm going to pick up your black ass, right? That kind of thing, right? So there was this performative black masculinity, stereotypes about black masculinity and aggression, right? And they were for each other in terms of audience, but also whoever was on the receiving end of the phone, right?
Mm-hmm. Did you notice something about gender? You're going there. What is the gendered performance here? What was the gendered performance? Yes.
Yeah, I perceived that it was kind of the irony of a couple of black guys, maybe one speaking to his white wife or girlfriend in this very sort of code switching way. Another black guy comes along and instantly he jumps into black speech because he realizes that his fellow black man is going to, be accusing him of code switching, which isn't a great thing. But then the second black man walks away and kind of jumps into gay dialogue with his partner. So there's code switch one, black man changing from code speaking to his own black macho man speech. Black man number two jumping from black macho man speech into very kind of swishy.
A kind of effete linguistic performance, right? Yes. Gender and sexuality are bound up in this idea of code switching. Because when you say to someone that they can't be who they are or use the language from their home, you are also telling them that they have to switch their identities in other ways as well. And gender is one of them. It's why black men respond to school in the ways in which they do, by rejecting school, because it's almost as if they can't be black at school. And their blackness is represented through a kind of gender performance. And that gender performance leads to a kind of hyper masculine performance in relation to school or relation to standard or academic English as it is presented in school. That's in my book. It's not a formal part of this presentation, but I did want to point that out. All right. So in summary, on lesson 1, we have to be conscious of the ideologies of literacy and how they can produce and do produce violence. And we have to begin to center the experiences and representations of people of color as beneficial for all, not representations of people of color simply for people of color, but centering those experiences in academic context for everybody. That's the point of lesson 1. Moving to lesson 2. Black expression as art in language arts. This is leading towards my definition and my primary point on integrating Black English into the formal context of schools. I want to be very clear about what I'm saying. I am deliberately saying, in no uncertain terms, unequivocally, point blank, that Black English is appropriate in academic and professional contexts. There is no qualification. Because if you open your ears and listen, Black English is used by almost everybody in professional and academic contexts already. But in classrooms, somehow we ask students, or we perpetuate an ideology as if that is not the case. All you have to do is listen to the radio, listen to the news. This is not your 1950s news anymore. Language is expansive, and Black English is very provocative and evocative in traditional standard English context. Just listen for it. So our current ideology is not matching our current practice. Here's a video that will illustrate this. Now, some educators would see that as a performance and not academic. But I want you to see that performance as the exemplification of academic discourse. In the state of Michigan, here are their English standards. I hope you can see it. In order to be career and college ready in Michigan, they say that students need to be able to demonstrate argument and reasoning, use argument and reasoning to do research, and to contrast arguments and critique the reasoning of others. Did you see that? Him critiquing the reasoning of others? Yeah, yeah.
He actually it was kind of funny the way he was incorporating the structure suggested in They Say, I Say. It was like really funny. I was like, oh my God.
Absolutely.
That's adorable.
Absolutely. The thing to underscore, though, is that it was not a parody. Right. This is really the structure of his performance art. And it has an academic structure. Solve problems, construct explanations, and design solutions. Did you see that? The use of technology and tools strategically in learning and communicating. Wow. Use of technology, right? Even though it might have been recorded on a cell phone, it was uploaded to YouTube using technology strategically. And the fourth category, communicate and collaborate effectively with a variety of audiences. Now you saw the audiences, at least a set of audiences being performed as he was performing and collaborating with them as he gives his speech. In all 4 of the major categories, that African American expression and performance meets the academic standards. So we have to stop seeing African American performativity and expression as anti-academic. It already is academic in so many ways, meeting these state standards. Let's look at another one. Minnesota standards. Well, take my word for it. I'm going to go to the next slide. And I'm going to pause on this slide because Thomas Kochman wrote this essay Culture and Communication, Implications for Black English in the Classroom in the late 80s. And his viewpoint has not generally obtained yet, but I think from our looking at Morrison's performance, you can see what Kochman means and why he makes a valid point. This is what Kochman says. It is inconceivable to me that an intelligent Black student who can demonstrate the entire range of oral skills should not pass the introductory course in college English. In other words, if a student in an oral fashion can do the things that you saw Moise do, then that student should pass college English. I agree. And in fact, that's in line with the NCTE guidelines for English language arts. The National Council of Teachers of English lists 6 arts of language that should be used all the time in the English classroom from K through college. That is reading and writing, speaking and listening, viewing, and visually representing. And you can see that they have a relationship. Reading to writing, or reading, writing, listening to speaking, or listening to speech, and visually representing something in digital spaces or in artistic spaces and viewing it. And when we encourage all of these arts as opposed to only one, writing, then we actually are teaching students to be good communicators and teaching them how to use literacy effectively. No offense to Sal. The reason why I'm saying that is because I know you direct writing. And I think that by seeing, because writing's such a big thing in university culture, well, we need to expand our purview about what it means to write and what it means to read. And we need to bring in these other arts so that students are able to harness their rhetorical effectiveness. Here's the summary of lesson 2. Black expressive culture and language are compatible with and exceeds national and state standards for language arts. Black expressive culture and language exceeds national and state standards for language arts. If you just take Moise, that clip from Moise as an example. So in order to fully embrace this ideological and pedagogical perspective, I promote the idea of code meshing, which is instead of asking students to use one kind of discourse at school and another kind of discourse at home, we ask them to bring all of their discourses to all of those spaces and to use all of what they're learning in rhetorically sophisticated ways. That's what we do in school. I'm going to step out to the audience because I really want to underscore this point. Some people think that if you allow African Americans or other students to use their home language, that you are not teaching. That is simply not true. The fact that they come to school means that the language will change. School is the place where you learn to do different things. The point here is that you allow them to use their rhetorical framework that they bring from home as a resource in this context to buttress and harness their rhetorical effectiveness. Does that make sense? We're not saying, the old idea is that if you allow that to come to this space, it's going to somehow denigrate the academic context. False. It's going to increase and help them in the academic context. It's that fear, that stereotype threat that leads students to be less effective in writing and speaking in academic context. Yes.
Would anybody be offended? I'm going to talk about the 60s in Mississippi for just a minute. Is that okay? I grew up in Mississippi, and this is one of the reasons why they didn't want to integrate the schools. You know, we were taught as children that no, you can't do that, because if you bring if you have that in the schools, it's going to bring down the language. I'm being honest here. I'm telling you exactly the way it was. And I hope nobody in here is upset with me or offended by that. But that's just the way it was. And as children, we didn't understand. I mean, I was 6 years old, you know. And that's the kind of, excuse my language, that's the kind of crap those are the reasons that they had. And it's incredible to me that people would go along with that. You know, people went along with that and they just accepted that. I'm sorry, am I being naive? I'm sorry. I hope that, is anybody upset with me for saying that? I'm just saying though, and this is really, you know, I'm agreeing with everything that you're saying. You know,
Thank you.
I think that absolutely it's way past time to get rid of that kind of thinking. It's dangerous and it's hurtful and it keeps people from learning. Anyway, sorry, I just can't stand it.
Well, she just made my point, so I'm going to truncate the presentation since. No, that's okay.
Sitting on the edge of my seat.
My point here is now about code meshing and allowing these languages to coexist. I want you to see the way in which this performance artist code meshes a professional decorum and a professional context. So it's a common routine for people when they're ill, sick, emotionally or otherwise, to call in to work if they can't work. But the interesting thing about this is Evelyn has to say she can't call in Black to work, even though she is affected by what she is witnessing in the media, what she witnesses and experiences on a daily basis is not an allowable reason or circumstance to call in to work. And that's why she said it would be so clutch to call in Black to work. She's grieving. But if you think about other contexts where people who experience tragedies, not even as routinely on a daily basis, but maybe at one time how they can call in to work because they're grieving, or how counselors and social workers are provided for people who experience tragedies, but not provided on an everyday basis to African Americans who witness episodes like Eric Garner and others. It almost seems as if Black people are just supposed to witness that and be okay and not think that that could just as likely be me tomorrow or later today, and how that makes us feel. And for it to be an unallowable conversation at the workplace where I am bringing my emotional, mental, and psychological response. So this is on the discursive rhetorical level where Blackness and topics that relate to Black people and Black humanity also have to be a recognized, privileged part of discourse in professional environments, in workplaces, and in schools. I want to sort of shift to presenting you with a problem with the code switching ideology, because it's so embedded in our culture and in our teaching practices that it's hard to see sometimes. So I want to illustrate that, and it's keep me on track with the time too. I want to ask you, after I show you these videos, what problems you see with code switching. Again, here code switching meaning, in the reductive sense, switching the way you speak and act from one context to another. from school and home or work and home. What did you notice about his response to code switching? There's two responses, right? Yes.
Well, I noticed that he said he can do it, and then he kind of made this face like it was in pain, like, ugh, don't ask me to do that.
Anybody else? Yeah.
Just his body language changed. He looked extremely uncomfortable, and like he didn't want the camera in his face anymore. Just, he changed into a completely different person, as well as his voice changing. So.
Yeah. But when she was asking him those leading questions about whether code switching was appropriate and whether it should be done, he presented a buy-in to that perspective. Yeah, you have to do it. And if I had a job, even distinguishing different types of jobs to show where that would be appropriate. And the reason why he has to do that is because of a point I made earlier, that code meshing is already done all the time. So we have to sort of do some kind of gymnastics in our mind to think of the place where African-American discourse really does not exist, and you have to switch. And to him, it's a job, even though there was no specific profession. But the other thing is that at the end, he said, I don't like to do that, unprompted. His real, authentic response. And I'm not going to do that. That's why I'm going to the NFL. Replacing an academic context with a sports context where he thinks he would be able to excel without having to use a different kind of language, where language is not required, where his body is required. And this is a response that a lot of African-American men in particular, and African-Americans in general, have to school because of this ideology. I don't want to do that. I cannot be successful in this academic context because of what you're asking me to do linguistically, which is really very difficult to do, to leave your language and yourself somewhere else and pretend like you're not, all of you is not in that same space. Yes.
So I'm a school counselor at the elementary level, and I'm fully aware of my whiteness, and I want to learn how to...
Oh, sorry.
Okay. Thank
Didn't
you
mean
for the
to do
background music. I'm trying to envision, I know there's a lot of unintentional racism that happens in schools, and I know if I were to interview every single one of the teachers that I work with, they would say that they are never intentionally racist. So how do they change their language? How do they change their approaches when working with our students of color to support this code meshing as opposed to code switching?
I haven't gotten there yet.
Great.
But I'm trying to quickly get there.
Great.
Here's another video that illustrates this problem, and then we're going to get to this question. You see the effect of the kind of psychological, I might even say educational violence on these African American students. We had a discussion in the workshop earlier that, and I'm going to use it here to help make the point, because I think it makes the point really well, is that these two students that you just saw were doing the things that the teacher was trying to get the black male to do in the previous video, right, to code switch. They're doing it, and still what? I'm sorry? Not good enough. Still not good enough. So the problem, this helps us to pinpoint the real problem is not in the language. The real problem is not in the use of language. The real problem is that we have displaced racism onto language. But the racism and the prejudice is still there even when you take the language out. We just use language as a conduit for prejudicial practices in schools, to have a segregationist ideology in what it means to teach reading and writing. Now, I want to continue to this video because this is what she's about to say is often what happens. We recognize the pain, even she recognizes it, couldn't control her crying, and yet this is what happens. So her strategy and her solution is to work even harder. When working harder is not going to get her out of the problem. But this is the ideological basis that we are confronted with every day in our society. Increase the burden on the people who are burdened, to work harder to overcome a burden that's still going to be there no matter how hard they work, because they're attacking the wrong problem. The wrong problem really is the prejudice that exists against brown and black people. You can't put it any other way. And these examples really illustrate it. And that's why I spend a lot of time talking about race in my research. Some of my colleagues criticize me and say, Vershawn, you're in composition and rhetoric, you're in writing, and you hardly ever talk about writing. Well, yeah, because I have a hard time getting to the writing when I know that there's something really huge that's impacting the writing. So I want to deal with that. Now, y'all can deal with the writing. I'm going to deal with this, and we're going to put them together because there's a racial problem that exists. So, we've been talking about code switching as situational code switching, but linguists define code switching in this way, as using two or more dialects or languages in one speech or writing act. It could also be alternating the use of two languages in one act. So educators have taken code switching, one aspect of it, and made it the whole definition of code switching, which is situational. Talk this way at home and talk this way at school, and that's really a world language or foreign language view of code switching, where you can actually switch from Spanish and German or German and English. And even then it's kind of problematic because you're probably not going to completely leave the German at home. That's how we can know that someone's from Germany when we hear their accent break through in this context. Here's a linguist.
It's strategic use too, right? I have a friend who, he's not from the East Coast, but he lived back there for a few years, and I've heard him on the phone, with customer service people, and he's trying to get his way, and he starts talking like this because he wants to sound intimidating, and it works.
But you get the point, right? That even in the situational code switching, it's still very difficult to leave that language at home. And the concept of accent helps illustrate that, because we see that the accent breaks through the target language. And if you think about that from a performative stance, it's hard to leave black culture at home if you're an African American person and you've grown up in a particular black culture. There's no way that I'm not going to be black at work. It's going to come through. And when people expect me not to be as black as I am at work, that causes problems, because it's going to show, it's going to come out, my cultural references, etc. So I want to highlight the linguistic definition of code switching, which is using two or more dialects or languages in one speech act. That is to say that linguists understand that two languages can't operate simultaneously in one speech act. And that's what I have been calling code meshing, because educators have taken code switching to be only situational code switching. Here's an example. Did you see the combination of languages? And it did not interfere with our overall understanding of the rhetorical motives and the rhetorical message that she was sending. As a matter of fact, the blending of those languages added to the rhetorical effect. And if you're not a high-level or proficient Spanish speaker, it didn't matter. You could still interpret what the message was and actually learned from it, learn some other different language habits, vocabulary, etc., by this code switching. Well, what I would call code meshing. So she demonstrated in that video two aspects of code meshing or code switching, intrasentential and intersentential. Intrasentential is alternation of two languages in one sentence. For example, I'm not going to school porque no me siento bien. I'm not going to school because I don't feel well. Alternating between two languages in one sentence. Intersentential, alternation between two sentences. I'm not going to school today. No me siento bien. She did both of them in her comedy sketch. So metaphorical code switching is using more than one language in a single piece of writing. And that's what I've been terming code meshing. Not that I've invented something new linguistically. It's simply that I didn't want to have the argument with educators that they were misappropriating and misusing code switching. Because every time I would say code switching, they might have this prior understanding. So there's a new term to describe where code switching really is anyway in an educational context, which is code meshing. Some teachers who espouse code switching, they get it wrong. Here's an example. Rebecca Wheeler, who is a linguist, a sociolinguist who teaches in a teacher ed program, and one of her students who was a third grade teacher at the time, Rachel Swords, wrote a book called Code Switching, published by NCTE in 2006. And they use Langston Hughes and Toni Morrison as examples of how Black students can code switch. And they say Hughes and Morrison are able to switch between their vernacular and the standard dialect as their literary goals demand. And here's their example. Well, this is from Langston Hughes' poem, Mother to Son. Well, son, I'll tell you, life for me ain't been no crystal stair. It's had tacks in it and splinters and boards torn up and places with no carpet on the floor. Bare. Now, what's interesting about their example is that Langston Hughes is not switching from one language to another one according to a literary demand. He is blending African American language and standard English in one rhetorical context. Here's another thing. They also use, I don't have Morrison there, but they use Toni Morrison. And if anybody has read or listened to Toni Morrison's Nobel acceptance speech, she begins by talking about an African American woman, the story that she knows, the descendant of slaves. And someone would say, well, her prose is very standard prose. Yes, but language has a linguistic and a rhetorical aspect always, and you can't separate the two. So Toni Morrison's rhetorical strategy is Black. She's infusing Black culture in that Nobel acceptance speech. And these educators missed that point. To make that point, imagine on a common basis in elementary school and in high school to show how Toni Morrison in her Nobel Prize speech is using Black rhetoric would be amazingly good for Black students' self-esteem in a literacy context. Amazingly helpful. The other thing I want to say about this is something that is not commonly understood about African American English. I've been talking about African American English as if it is something separate from standard English, and I want to tell you that to a certain extent, actually to a large extent, that just isn't true. The linguist Lisa Green, in her book, The African American Language and the Child, did a study of African American preschool students and going into Head Start and kindergarten. And what she said is when those students are when they're using African American English in the formal register of African American English, because African American English is just like any other language that has an informal, middle, and formal range. All languages have that. But we tend to conflate African American English with standard English and to say it's only the informal mode of standard English. That's the way we understand African American English. That's a problem. It is both separate and related to standard English. What what Lisa Green says is that when African American children are using the formal register of African American English, it is hard to tell where the African American English ends and the standard English begins. That's huge. It's hard to tell when people are speaking African American English where it ends when they're in the formal register and standard English begins. What that says to me is that it's already a part of standard English. And to ask someone to switch out of it creates really a linguistic schizophrenia if it's already related to standard English. Does this make sense? So, my overall point is that we need to reframe code switching as code meshing and to adopt and allow the full range of code switching, not just situational. I'm not saying that situational isn't important. It is important because in some contexts, we change the register, not the language, but the register that we're using it in. If we're at a job interview, it might be more formal. That's not switching from language to language. That's adjusting the register of the language. Does that make sense? And so we need to adopt and allow the full range of code switching. And we need to take a translingual approach to language instruction. And I want to read this because this is what the translingual approach means. It sees difference in language not as a barrier to overcome, not as something students should not be able to use in different contexts, or as a problem to manage, but as a resource for producing meaning in writing, speaking, reading, and listening. So that means no matter what language habits our students come to us with, they are never a problem, they are never a barrier, they are always a resource to be mined in any and every context, and the mining is theirs, not ours. In other words, we have to teach students to have agency, authority, and authenticity in their writing, and it is their agency that they need to develop and their authority over their own rhetorical acts in speaking and writing. Sometimes teachers take a very, I want to say, somewhat patriarchal view that I have to save my students from the oppression that they might experience. It is the student's choice, not ours, because we don't know all of the things that our students are going to experience, and we may be restricting them from being as effective as they could be. Let me give you an example. Just walk outside of this building and outside and look at all the advertising and think, is the advertising closer to standard English or is it closer to African American English? Watch TV. It's closer to what we consider to be African American English. And if we're telling our students don't use African American English in professional context, well, who is doing all these advertisements that are so catchy? It just doesn't make a lot of sense. It's an ideology that's more problematic than helpful. It's more problematic than helpful. Let me give you an example with Stuart Scott. Most of you probably remember Stuart Scott, the late ESPN sports caster. And Stuart Scott, in this writing about him, used African American English from the very first moment he was on ESPN. Now, did it go over well? Yes, it did. But did his managers have concern? Yes, they did. And one of his managers called him into the office and said, concerned about all these African-American references that you are using on your show. And Stuart Scott didn't argue with the manager, but he wrote an op-ed piece thanking his bosses for allowing him to use African-American English. So he was being satirical. And he said, I use the language from my church, I use the language from my home, I use the African-American English and bring it here, and now these are part of sports discourse. Booyah! Stuart Scott is an exemplification of code meshing. So the point here is that Will some people have concerns when they hear African American English used? Yes. But again, it's their agency, like Stuart Scott's agency, his authenticity and his authority over his language use. It's not our job to scare students or threaten them into using one particular mode of English that we think will protect them. As we've already seen in this presentation, that is not the case. So changing the ideology and the perspective is what's most important. Is that my last slide? So here's the summary of lesson 3. We want to embrace language habits as a resource first, rather than as a barrier to overcome, and embrace code meshing. And I think this embracing of code meshing will impact the way in which violence is occurring and being perpetuated in literacy instruction in classrooms, but also in society. Thank you.
Does anyone have questions? I don't know how much time we have left, but I'm willing to stick around as long as anyone needs to. So,
I'm wondering if there's been any sort of formal boycott against or action against the study.com people, and who those people are that are creating those materials.
I don't know.
Okay.
But I will tell you the reason why I have not written to study.com and asked them about this, because this is too good of an example. And I think if I told them, they're going to change it, and it won't make the point when I go around talking to people. So it's sort of self-serving. But I don't think that my writing to them will stop the larger practice. And and so I want to use that to help stop the larger practice. But I don't think there's been any boycott against it, and I haven't written to them.
Thank you so much. This has been great. One of the questions I have is, how do we tell the difference between consumption of and appropriation of Black English and not mistake that for racial justice, for violence against Black bodies? Is this kind of making, I don't know if I'm making sense. Is that like acceptance of the language, celebrating it, consuming it, versus real racial justice? I don't know if I'm making sense.
Yeah.
Like I think there's, how do I, like, white kids using the N-word or saying like, we love rap and we love this language and this is great. Like, loving Black culture, but hating Black people.
Right.
That's basically what I'm talking about.
Right.
I don't know how
right.
else to say.
I hear your question, and I think it's an important question. And I think we cannot have the racial justice, true racial justice, at the expense of Black English or Black language. In other words, what I'm saying is, we have to have the larger conversation. We have to put it both in racial terms and linguistic terms at the same time. We cannot talk about language isolated from race, although it's not a common practice to talk about race and gender in the literacy classroom or in that context, but it has to be in order to move in the direction of social justice without replicating or perpetuating the oppression. Does that make sense? The other thing is that those 3 key terms that I listed, authenticity, agency, and authority, also need to be talked about in a classroom where appropriation of someone else's language could lead to caricatures, stereotyping, and negative consequences or effects. So the authority and authenticity of someone's adopting or appropriating African American English needs to be seriously considered. I am not somebody that says that African American English is off limits for other cultures, because that doesn't work the same way linguistically, and the vice versa. Language should be used by everybody, and we come into contact with different language speakers, we do adopt some of their language habits. But we have to be very conscious about the history of African American language being used to caricature and disparage Black people. And people who do not come from their culture have to be very careful about their authenticity in using that language. And it has to be at the conscious level. It's too easy to say, I'm not going to use it and don't use it. That's too easy. Because really, American culture is highly influenced by African American culture and language. It's more important and more appropriate to talk about the ways in which we're using it and why.
So, not being a native speaker, I look at language in a different way. And the way it comes across to me is a form of order.
A form of what?
Order.
Order?
Yeah, it's a structure imposed externally upon others how to articulate themselves. So, as a form of order, when you do not speak in that form, it also can be seen as a form of resistance. So in other words, when you look at language out of its structure that has been mandated externally on bodies, exactly how to use it, when it's not used in that manner, it could be interpreted as a form of resistance, which essentially that talks to the fact that kids across the globe, when they accept and utilize African American speaking style, it's a form of resistance as well. So in other words, they're not simply mimicking, they're trying to express themselves in an alternative way to show that they do not accept the order, right? So from that standpoint, I think looking at writing from a form that has to be manipulated to impose order on students or impose on somebody from the outside who chooses to speak in a particular way is an imposition of a structure that itself is a form of violence.
Say the last part again. Is that a statement or a question?
It's a statement. I want you to react to that in a way, because the reason you were interpreting this, act of violence is when you do not accept an order and it's imposed on you, right? And so now you're speaking it, but you don't really feel comfortable doing it because now they made you do something you don't want to do, right? So it is in itself, adopting another order is a form of violence imposed on a body that doesn't accept that order.
You shaking your head. You want to respond?
No, I agree. I was kind of saying, I followed everything he said and I understood what he was saying. I guess that's really all to say. I totally get what he was saying. And I think, but I don't want to take this to a place. Often when people say something, I think about how I can make that have meaning to me. And again, I was trying to think of being a woman and how that feels in a patriarchal world. And so exactly what he was saying about the language, I was translating into myself as being a woman and being like, yes, now I know what that feels like as a person trying to do that and have that imposed upon them. So all of a sudden I was like, oh, I get that. I know that feeling. So that was my nod.
Okay.
Okay, so I'll go down that path too, because I was sitting here thinking about how coming here from the South, and as soon as I open my mouth, I'm pegged, and I've had people, sort of make me embarrassed about the way I talk, and I can't, I know that it's not in any. It doesn't approach the level of violence that you're talking about. But I'm just trying to, she was saying, I'm trying to understand a little bit of what that feels like. And it's like, yeah, you're trying to impose an order on me that I don't want to change the way I talk. And why should I? And why can't I express myself the way I want to? So in just a teeny little way, I sort of, I understand just a little bit about that.
Okay.
Just
are these accurate representations of what you were saying?
Yeah, I think you become aware. That's really
okay.
The issue is that when in the classroom, context of the classroom, you keep editing the person to make them talk a certain
Right.
way.
Yes.
You are eventually going to tell them you need to assimilate.
Right.
Resistance is
right. Yeah.
You need to actually be. So at that moment, you're asking them to give up their personality.
Right. You're also asking them to give up their own authority over their language, in which each person should have authority over their own language. The other thing I want to react to, this is going to be a little touchy, okay? This is just my own personal belief, is that sometimes trying to understand someone else's problem by translating it into one that you might face is a problem. Let me tell you why I'm saying that. Because you don't have to in any way experience a problem to share an understanding of something that is wrong. That's so you can be in the most privileged position possible and not have any degree or to the same degree the experience of oppression, and you should still be empathetic and sympathetic to the problem that Black people face. Does this make sense? And so we sit with it from the experience that's being related to us by the person who is experiencing the problem. And it sort of lands there. Does that make sense? Yes.
We have like
1 minute
questions, then we're just about we're done. But people can stay and ask afterwards.
Yeah. So I'm thinking about how does this happen, right? Why does this happen in these ways? And I'm struck by just a realization that part of why I might unintentionally, unwittingly do this in my classroom, right, is that I don't have the skills, right? I'm ill-equipped to actually I'm ill-equipped to instruct and to evaluate and assess the different types of expression, right? And so that I translate that into saying, well, then the person is not able to perform in the way that I know how to evaluate their performance, right? And so then I push it on them when ultimately what I'm also saying is that I'm not able to evaluate them where they are, right? I'm not able to see the skills that they have and to evaluate their ability to communicate and argue and develop arguments and all that chart that you went through in Minnesota or whatever it was, right? And so the question, so I can see that long-term vision for, okay, well that's something that needs to change, right? That's something that needs to be confronted. What in the meantime, right? Because I'm a professor here. I've developed this way of being, and I can start trying to do better. Learn new things and develop new skills and kind of change my own participation in this kind of dominance. That's not. I can't do that tomorrow, right? And so it's not that you have these answers for
I have the answer.
You have the answer.
Yeah.
Oh,
I do have
awesome.
the answer. Here's the answer.
Yeah.
If people are dying, you can't wait a week or two. You have to do it tomorrow. There is no patience. Is not a political strategy. This is what we learned today from Joni Jones. We ask so many people to wait to get justice because we may not be experiencing it directly ourselves. But if we were experiencing it, we'd want it tomorrow. And we would ask the professors to put themselves in a learning position to enact this quicker. So I want to say 2 or 3 things. That patience or that long-term thing that you're asking for, it needs to happen today. And it needs to happen today because people's lives are affected. And that's the kind of empathy that we need to come to and the kind of ethical disposition we need to have when it comes to dealing with people who are traditionally oppressed. Now, here's the other thing. As a teacher, we have to sort of decenter our authority to evaluate everything and allow the students to help us assess what's happening. In other words, when we talk about, especially in the writing classroom, writing for multiple audiences, we are not just writing for the white male teacher that's standing in front of us. We're trying to develop rhetorical effectiveness that exceeds what you're evaluating. And that is what the teacher should be helping us harness, not standing in the way of only evaluating what they are limitedly prepared to evaluate. Does that make sense? When it comes to a code meshing classroom, students are bringing in knowledge. They are bringing in the resources. Hey, from this culture, this is really effective. That's why I'm using that here, and the teacher has to accept it. And the teacher has to be open to say, is this rhetorically effective to me? If it's not, say, why not? And that's the kind of dialogue that we have back and forth with the students, and that's why we're putting the language, the authority of their language in their hands, not in mine. From what you have said, bear with me, from what you have said, you are maintaining an authoritative perspective over students' language habits. And I am saying you're gonna have to, if you are really interested in the social justice aspect, reduce that authoritative perspective and allow yourself to be wrong, and allow yourself to be in a position to enlarge even your own rhetorical knowledge basis by what the students are bringing to you. Does that,
absolutely. I'm agreeing with you, right? I mean, that's the nature of the question, right? Is saying that I'm agreeing with that point of view, but agreeing with that point of view doesn't mean that tomorrow I know how to do it, right? I can try, I can start, and I can commit to it. So I'm agreeing with you 100%. But I've just spent, as you say, the last 10, 12, 15, 20 years learning how to hold on to my authority in the classroom in ways that I shouldn't, right? And so, so it's just that. I
don't want to be reductive, but I want to say a couple things. We know how to listen. Or maybe some of us don't. But listening carefully and allowing what others say to be knowledge in the classroom space, I would say that most trained professionals should be able to do that. The other thing is that we already have instructional strategies in place that we commonly use, we just don't use them for this purpose. For example, looking up words, getting definitions and incorporating those words into our vocabularies. How many times do we read something and circle the unfamiliar word, write it in the margins, summarize in 2 sentences what is being said? Well, when we use that in a rhetorical way to students' discursive practices, we are putting ourselves in a position to learn, and we can teach that to students to do too, not in all types of, with all types of writing and language acts. So there's going to be diverse students in our classroom if they come with a different kind of rhetorical style. I don't have to know Chinese or the Chinese rhetorical framework. That's what they know. And they're going to bring that knowledge into the classroom, and then it's going to become a part of the knowledges that exist to create effective rhetoric in this classroom space. So we're decentering our traditional power, because really our traditional power, especially as language teachers, has been used to police, mostly, not necessarily to enlarge. I just want to leave them with a couple examples so you can see why this is important for everybody. So Geneva Smitherman, the sociolinguist, did a study in her that's reported in her essay, The Blacker the Berry. And she was part of a team that graded thousands of essays of high school students. And the students' essays that had the highest features of African American rhetoric had the highest scores on those essays. Now, when they did the study with names on them, the students whose use of African American rhetoric corresponded to an African American sounding name had reduced scores, even though in another setting, those same papers increased. What I'm trying to say here is that when we talk about African American rhetoric and language, it is beneficial for everybody in our culture, not just for African Americans. And we should begin to privilege that as a source, as a resource for all students. All right, is that it? All right, thank you.
Right.